of our live stream on History 5 podcast. Today I'm joined by Dominic Crossan, and today we're discussing his new book, Paul the Pharisee, A Vision Beyond the Violence of Civilization. It's good to have you back on the show, Dom.
Always a pleasure, Jacob, to be with you. Thank you very much for having me.
And thank you very much for joining me. Can you briefly introduce the audience to what your new book is about? I mean, obviously it's about Paul, but can you tell us more about it?
Yes, people talk about the new Paul, understanding Paul as a Jew. I would add as a messianic Christique. I'm not saying Christian, because that means a separation between Judaism and this other, eventually, religion. Pharisee. What exactly does a Pharisee mean? That's the heart of the book. If you explore that all the way down to the depths, you got the book. Obviously, the Pharisees have I would call it a libelous description in the New Testament. They're kind of nitpicking legalists, hypocrites, in fact. This is part of the infighting between two groups fighting for the center, Messianic, Christic Jews and Pharisaic Jews. So could we scratch all of that? Dismiss it the way you would if you're listening to two candidates lacerating one another in public television or something. Go to Josephus. If you want to understand what Pharisees are about, bracket the New Testament, go to Josephus. What you find basically is they're very faithful traditionalists. And that's kind of ironic because the other major thing he tells you about them is they have this magnificent theory, which we're going to have to explore, about the resurrection. And of course, if I was a Sadducee, the first thing I would tell them is there ain't no tradition about the resurrection. If you're traditionalists, where did you get it? Show me that in the Old Testament, the Torah, the prophets, the wisdom. And they'll have to come up with some explanation that, it's oral tradition. It's handed down orally. But the heart of a Pharisee is this belief in the resurrection. And I would ask the audience not to presume they know what that means, because what we're going to do is go into the first century and find out what it means. Then you can dislike it or like it or discard it or reject it. But you can't do that till you know what they're talking about. So a major question in the book is, when a Pharisee in the first century, or Paul, get him, said resurrection, what did they mean before Jesus ever arrived on the scene?
So I'd like to take us to the beginning of the situation. So when Paul was persecuting Christians, was he persecuting them on his own, or did he have help from authorities? Who was he working for specifically?
All right, now we're touching here on whether we can use Luke Acts on Paul. And Luke Acts has excellent information on Paul and bad interpretation of Paul. Not by mistake, by the way. Luke knows exactly what he's doing and doing it brilliantly. He's preparing the long road to Constantine. That's what he's actually doing. So you'd have to be very careful with what you use from Luke Acts about Paul. For example, in Luke Acts, Paul is a sort of a mega persecutor. He starts in Jerusalem before he ever gets to Damascus, by the way. He's already persecuting in Jerusalem under authority from the high priest. So he's a big shot persecutor. The trouble is that Paul himself tells us in Galatians that when he first went to Jerusalem, none of these people he was supposed to have persecuted knew him. Now, you really do know your persecutor. That's the one person you know. So Paul's story, as far as I'm concerned, Paul's story, not Luke's story about Paul, begins in Damascus. I think he was probably, Luke got it right, I think, at least I have no reason to doubt it, born in Tarsus, and I think he went, shall I say, for graduate education to Damascus, not to Jerusalem. For Luke, everything begins in Jerusalem and goes out from Jerusalem westward. So he was a persecutor. I think of him as something like orthodoxy enforcer in the synagogue of Damascus. Maybe that's his own job, as it were. I've no reason to think that he's credentialed to do it, but he probably was ultra conservative and didn't like any new ideas coming in about maybe this weirdo Jesus who was somehow the Messiah. These are the people he was persecuting, fellow Jews in the synagogue at Damascus who claimed that Jesus was, in anglicized Hebrew or Aramaic, the Messiah, anglicized Greek, the Christ, of course. That was what he was persecuting. He was persecuting it without a doubt. He says so, and on that Luke agrees.
Does the circumstances of Paul fleeing from Damascus in Acts, does it contradict 2 Corinthians when 2 Corinthians says that Paul fled from King Aretas, whereas in Acts he seems to be fleeing from other Jews that want him dead?
Thank you for that, Jacob, because this is where we can see it. I rest my whole case in the court of law on this because it corroborates what I've said. Luke knows about the exit, the exit strategy from Damascus over the walls because the gates are guarded. Now, Paul says he went out because the Nabateans under that's King Aretas IV, with his capital down at Petra, was guarding the gates to arrest him. All right, that's one thing. Luke says the Jews, quotation marks, the Jews were guarding the gates to kill him. Now, no, in the first centuries, first of all, the Jews didn't guard the gates of Arab cities. No, that's unhistorical. And the idea that somehow the high priest in Jerusalem had power to go all the way to Damascus in a different Roman area and use rendition as it were and brings people back, that's not even good history. That's pure fiction to make Paul, as I said, the super persecutor. So Paul tells us, and it makes sense because we know that Aretas IV was a great king, by the way, for the Nabateans, ruled until about the year 40 or so. And he's really pushing the power of the Nabateans north towards Damascus. I think that's what he's after. Aretas III had held Damascus, so the Nabateans are on the march, moving north to take Damascus. If Paul is a Jew, as he is, and he's working in Nabatea, he calls it Arabia, which is fine. He's working in Arabian Nabatea. He's in trouble. He's the wrong person, wrong time, wrong place, wrong purpose. So yeah, he's fleeing. All of that makes absolutely good historical sense. Luke does not make good historical sense, but a good polemical sense, because it's the Jews who are always causing trouble. Not us people. The Jews are causing trouble. See, they tried to kill Paul. It's part of Luke's polemic, going all the way back to Luke chapter 4 in the Gospel, that the problem is not the Christians, but the Jews.
Now let's get to the circumstances of Paul's apparent conversion. What do you think caused it, besides his claim that he supposedly had a vision of the risen Christ? Did he feel guilty about persecuting the Christians? What was going on in Paul's mind?
The one thing I can't find anywhere in Paul is a hint of guilt. He's the most self-confident person I know. When he talks about in Romans about, oh, weak person that I am, he's not talking about himself. He's imagining the human race. He's personifying the human race. Paul is about the most self-confident, and I'm not using that as a criticism, the self-confident writer. I think he's far more confident than Augustine is, for example. Augustine is plagued by guilt and foisted on the whole of Christian tradition. I don't get that in Paul. I don't get it at all. He persecuted, and I think it was his role as a Pharisee that assisted him to make the pivot from being a anti-Messianic Christic Jew to becoming a pro-Messianic Christic Jew. Because he could have converted to minding his own business. He could have converted to speaking to Jews. He goes the full, I don't know if it's 180% from the persecutor to the supporter, the persecutor to the promoter. So how is that possible without a psychic break? I mean, you can say revelation, and I have no doubt about it, he had a visionary, but even visions have to be distinguished from psychotic breaks. You could have a vision and go straight into a mental institution. So how is he able to shift? I think the core thing is that he was a Pharisee. He believed in the resurrection at the end of time. That's the great contribution from the Pharisees, that the world was ruled by cosmic justice, that at the end of time there would be a great reckoning on every one of the human race. And I'm not taking this literally, but I'm taking it very seriously. Every single person in the whole human race would rise up and be judged and go to heaven or hell. Now, taken literally, I think that's bunk. But taken metaphorically, I think it's lethally correct. Every human being who has ever lived, including you and I, are responsible for the state of the world and the creation of heaven and hell within it, and possibly for the fact that hell is winning. So when Paul says that this vision of cosmic justice has begun with Jesus, with the resurrection, he's using a pharisaic vision and applying it to Jesus. That's the pivot. Because when he first heard about Jesus as the Messiah, that must have meant to him, well, if the Messiah is here, the messianic age has begun. We thought that meant the general resurrection. Where is that evident? And then Paul's great revelation. I think you can have it in a blinding ecstasy if you want, but even a blinding ecstasy has to have a content, is that resurrection has already begun. The process of heaven and hell is already operational within human time. That's a heck of a revelation. And quite frankly, I think it is correct. And that has nothing to do with religion or Christianity or Paul is an apostle. I'm just hearing him as an ancient thinker with a vision of the world that seems to me to be absolutely correct if I just look at the evening news.
When Paul converted to the faith, did he have the same views of Jesus as many others around him did, or were his views different from them?
I think his views are far more radical, honestly. I've used the slogan, you remember the last time we talked about who's afraid of the big bad Paul, and we said most of the New Testament. And that's not a crack, that's accurate. Luke Acts is a huge, I don't know if I want to use the word whitewash, almost an obliteration. Whitewash is too gentle, of Paul as the apostle to the Gentiles. Paul's much too radical for him. What he wants to do is tone Paul down and in his place elevate Peter. Because if you read the Acts of the Apostles, for example, everything that happens to Paul happens first to Peter. Paul, for example, is miraculously freed from prison. Yeah, but Peter was earlier. Paul raises somebody from the dead. Peter had done it already. And the three great depictions of the conversion of Paul to become apostle of the Gentiles are already given to Peter in Acts 10 and 11 and 15. So the whole, I don't know what term even to use, the whole disguising of Paul in the Acts is both to put him in his place under Peter, who's not nearly as radical, possibly because he never wrote anything. Actually, he obviously two epistles are attributed to him. So the New Testament's job, in a way, is to de-radicalize Paul and sort of re-Romanize him for tolerant Roman consumption. And that continues outside the New Testament in all those scenes that we know from early Christianity, as early as the first century, where you have Peter embracing Paul. They're embracing one another, but sort of, if you look closely, it's always Peter's arms that are around Paul. Peter is accepting Paul. And we have that in the famous Christian belt buckle found at Stabia, therefore dates before 79 of the first century, because that's under Vesuvius's lava. So there was a huge problem in toning Paul down. In the letters, of course, they're written in his name, but were not done by him, but especially in Luke Acts. Luke Acts is the main one who tones Paul down, makes him safe for Christian consumption.
But on the other hand, does Acts seem to exaggerate, or does it also tone down his persecutions?
There's a tone down Paul's persecution. I don't think it does, Jacob, because it starts in Jerusalem, which is an extension of them. We have no evidence whatsoever he was ever in Jerusalem persecuting. He goes to Damascus, as you know, under authority from the high priests, with the right to take dissident Jews all the way back to Jerusalem for punishment. So I think it vastly expands geographically, at least, the persecuting power of Paul. And of course, that's totally imaginary for the persecuting power of the high priests. I mean, a lynching is always possible, but Rome did not allow the high priest to exercise power like that at all, not even to exercise lethal power. The one time it was done, killing James the Just, the high priest was pitched out of office for it. Rome had a monopoly on executions in the first century.
So, what was Paul's exact views of Jesus, and how did they differ from the others that he argued with, like with Peter, James, and others, etc.?
Okay, there's a term that Paul uses in Romans and again in Corinthians, which really is the crucial to his core. He talks about the mystery of God. He talks about the mystery that was hidden from all eternity in the mind of God and is finally revealed. And most people don't spend enough attention on, well, that must be big. What's he talking about? And the clue is, he says in Corinthians that the mystery is now revealed, but none of the rulers of this world understood it, because if they had, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. Now, here's how I interpret that. And we have to interpret it. It's there. What strikes Paul's imagination is, how is it possible that God, now I'm being careful about the verb, I'm going along with Paul's anthropomorphic vision of God, that God knew, that God allowed, that God decreed, that God decided that when the Messiah came, he would be executed. That stuns Paul. Why did God time it, since God can do whatever God wants? Why did God send, I'm going to use a verb he would have no problem using, send the Messiah in Jesus of Nazareth to be executed by the Roman Empire, the greatest empire the world has ever known, the one that boasts about its law and its order and its peace and its civilization. And this is Paul's great understanding. And it's rock bottom core in Paul. It's the heart of Paul. God thereby revealed the savage heart of civilization. Oh, so Roman law, Roman justice, all this stuff about Roman civilization, bringing civilization to the Germans in their forests and the Irish in their bogs. Well, they didn't quite do that to either of them. But anyway, bringing civilization, executed the Messiah. Now, maybe you and I can say, well, that's, things happen. That stunned Paul, because he had to ask himself, what was God up to? And what Paul understood is given away in that statement that the rulers of the world did not understand this because they wouldn't have crucified. It revealed their own hypocrisy, their own vacuity, their own emptiness, that the vaunted boasts of civilization are shown by this execution for Paul. Now, it's the execution of the Messiah, of course, but just one more poor Jew on a Roman cross, that would be just one more poor Jew on a Roman cross. But the execution of the Messiah showed the hollow heart of Rome, Roman law, for example. No wonder Paul says, what price law? But Rome was not just Rome. This is crucially important. It wasn't just Rome. It was Rome as the living example of civilization at its claimed best, at least. Whether Paul would have thought of it as the best or not is another question, but at least as claiming the best to be, better than the Assyrians, Babylonians, Greeks, or anyone else. So that's what raises the whole issue of resurrection for Paul. If God revealed the savage core of civilization by the execution of the Messiah, then resurrection, the cosmic justice of the world, says Paul, has to begin right now. By revealing the savagery of civilization, God also revealed the justice, the cosmic justice of God, not just the individual justice. So as clearly as I can say, that's the heart of Paul. That's the core, this revelation of the mystery. And he is being asked now, he says, in that text, to reveal this to the Gentiles, the nations. Sometimes, Jacob, I wish I had never used the term Gentiles in that book. It's too late to do it, but the nations. Now, remember, the nations is a term that includes the Jews. They're a nation too. So Gentiles, immediately means for us Jews, Gentiles. Paul usually talks about Jews and Greeks, but obviously a Jew could be a Greek. They're almost like ideological distinctions or linguistic distinctions or something, but it's to the nations. Let's cross out Gentiles, cross out nations, the world.
What did Paul think that God's plan was for the world?
I think, to be honest with you, I can't say much more than just repeat what I've just said. That's the way he sees it. He starts with a problem. Let me try and give an example. It's probably a feeble example, but supposing in our country, Martin Luther King Jr. had been arrested, officially, say, put in prison, put on trial, let's say, for treason, for maybe what he said about Vietnam or something, and was executed. What would that do if you were a supporter of Martin Luther King? You had to choose, obviously, between kind of your country and its justice or your dedication to Martin Luther King. That puts Paul, if you could put it to the power of 10 or 100, that's the position Paul is in. What on earth is going on in this world if God allowed, again, I use strong language, allowed the Messiah to come at the moment when God knew, of course, from Paul, that the Messiah would be crucified publicly, officially, not lynched or run over by a chariot, but publicly, legally, and Rome would approve. What's God up to? And I think the only answer I have is God is up to two things, like two sides of a coin. Can't have a one-sided coin. The execution of Jesus reveals, as I said, the violent heart of civilization, and the resurrection of Jesus, the other side of the coin, reveals the cosmic justice of God. That's Paul's vision. That's Paul's message. And if I think it is still a relevant message, whether you're a theist or an atheist, if you're looking at evolution, and whether you're a theist or an atheist, evolution is the way the world is run. I think that's right. Civilization has got us into the mess we're in at the moment. And is there a cosmic justice in the world? Or is it, do we get away with stuff? It seems to me, from an evolutionary point of view, I'm not talking about divine punishment, I'm talking about human consequences. Some bills are coming due to the human race at the moment. So there are consequences. And that would be the relevance of Paul for now. So it not depends, well, if I don't believe in God or the Bible or Jesus or Paul, he has a message like an ancient thinker would, as if you might, if I could use the analogy, you might be reading Plato today to see what Plato had to say to us. He's an ancient thinker.
When Paul tried to convert others into his faith, into his specific view of Jesus, what were his struggles there? And what was he trying to convince them to believe about Jesus?
I think it comes down to a way of life. That's what he would insist on. It comes down to a life. And you could see it, especially now, I'm focusing a little bit on the letters that were written in his name and whose function is to tone him down. Because that famous manifesto in Galatians about neither Jew nor Gentile, male nor female, slave nor free. Just think of that last one, neither slave nor free. Wait a minute. The whole economy, it's about the economy, dummy. The whole economy of the Roman Empire is a slave economy. Now, maybe it could be some other way, but that's not the point. It is a slave economy. It's based on slavery, people captured in wars, and even if the wars have toned down a bit now under the Pax Romana, slaves still bear slaves. So it's a slave economy. What does somebody mean by saying there's neither slave nor free? Well, we know what Colossians and Ephesians say about that. It means be nice to your slave. Of course, Christians can have slaves, but the master, speaking of the master, doesn't even mention the mistress, the master should be kind and the slave should be obedient. That's lovely, but it's a long, long way from neither slave nor free.
And when Paul comes into conflict with someone like Cephas in Galatians, and it's all over a matter of circumcision, some people come to sit down, and then Peter gets away from them because they're not circumcised. Is Paul trying to say that that Jesus has come to loosen up on the Torah? Is he using Jesus to say that circumcision is no longer necessary?
In conflict with James in Galatians, I think honestly, that's too mild a way of putting it. Though it's often put like that. He just wants to loosen up things. That would be like somebody, say, warning today about accelerated climate problems. They're just trying to loosen up things. It's not kind of strong enough. I think what Judaism in the first century, let me leave Jesus and Paul aside, was quite open to conversions. If a male, for example, wanted to convert to become a Jew, he'd have to be circumcised, of course, but he could become a Jew. That was fine. Now, there was also a whole other class, and this is not spoken enough about, called God-fearers or God-worshippers. That would be Gentiles, pagans, if you want to use that term, who've accepted the Jewish God, followed Jewish morality, attended the Jewish synagogue, but if male, they were not circumcised. Now, if they're female, that doesn't come, none of this comes up, of course. But male, they would not be circumcised. They're supporters. That was, in a way, a brilliant move. It was sort of conversion by attraction. It didn't bring on maybe the opposition that conversion might bring if a only son in the family converted to Judaism and they couldn't maybe take full participation in the Senate or something like that. So there was lots of options. But Paul's vision is that circumcision, fine for Jews, but a Gentile could be a full member of the people of God without being circumcised. That upped the ante. And as far as we can tell, and I think Luke gets this one right in the Acts of the Apostles, the constituency, the main clientele that Paul is appealing to is not the Gentiles in the forum. We never find him in the forum or the agora except in Athens, and then he's a dismal failure. They'll laugh at him. He's always in the synagogue, and he's addressing the God worshippers. Now think about that. Think of how explosive that is. He's poaching the God worshippers in the very synagogues themselves. And he's not loosening it up in one sense. He's telling them, you can be full members. Now, if I'm a Jew and I've been circumcised at birth and I hear him, am I hearing him saying, well, that's of no importance to you, you shouldn't have bothered? He's not saying that. I might hear it, but he ain't saying it. What he is saying is, you God worshippers, you God-fearers who attend the synagogue, you can be full members on a par with those born Jews, as I am on a par with Peter, for example, full members of the people of God without, if male, being circumcised. That's explosive within Judaism, and it may also be explosive among the God worshippers. So I can see Paul in trouble all over the Roman Empire, because if he was talking in the forum or the agora, talking to, let's call them, people who've never even heard of Judaism, let's say, he's not telling them you don't have to be circumcised. They would probably say, what's circumcision? Never heard of it. Or whoever thought we would? His message is in the synagogue, and he's trying to pick off the God worshippers. And no wonder there's fury all around everywhere Paul goes.
And can you tell us a little bit about the relationship between Ananias and Acts, this person that supposedly taught Paul, one of Paul's teachers?
Let me back up a little bit, Jacob, to the story of Luke and the conversion on the road, because when Luke tells a story, it's impossible to get it out of our mind, out of our visualization. He's so dramatic. And I'm not criticizing him for the theatrics of Paul, being struck down on the road. It's a great metaphor. You're converting from one position to the other, and it happens on the road. The metaphor is powerful. Where else does it happen? But the trouble is that he's blinded by the light. And when you're blinded, you don't see the risen Lord. And Paul repeats again and again, I have seen the Lord, Peter, and that makes me equal to you. I have seen the Lord. He doesn't even recognize the voice. He says, who is that, Lord? What Luke is doing in those three accounts, chapter 9, 22, and 26, three full accounts, is wiping out Paul as an apostle, and therefore, of course, as apostle to the Gentiles. He hasn't seen the Lord, so he's subordinate to Peter. Now, in the first one, of course, if he's blinded, what happens? Where are you going when you're blinded? He's on his way to Jerusalem, to Damascus, to persecute Christians, and he's blinded. Enter Ananias, who takes him by the hand, leads him in there, and baptizes him, and then he sees. Now, by the way, that's a magnificent metaphor for baptism. You're blind before, you're baptized, and you see. It's a lovely metaphor for other Christians. It doesn't work for Paul. So Ananias is a character. Maybe he's real. I have no idea. But he's not needed. He's not needed in Paul's story. Paul's story is of a revelation directly from Jesus to him in a vision.
And where did Paul get certain things from, like, say, the Eucharist, which he attributes to Jesus? Did he, somebody that knew Jesus, like maybe somebody like James, told him about it? Or did he hear it from somebody else? Do you think Jesus actually said that?
Well, I begin going back to what we do know, and I take as exactly factual. He persecuted in Damascus. Now, when you persecute people, you know a fair amount about what they hold. This is an ideological persecution. He is persecuting people who claim, I think, at least Jesus is Messiah. Would he also hear other stuff? Possibly. So let's leave that there. He's not starting off blank. I don't like what you people hold enough to persecute you. And I think he is persecuting them by casting them out of the synagogue. That's what he's after. Now, that doesn't mean, just like it might mean today, possibly, if you're dismissed from a church, you could do fine outside it. If you were dismissed from Judaism, you might fall between worlds. You know, you're not really a Gentile, you're not really a Jew. You could be destroyed, even financially. So it's serious business. So I think he did know a fair amount about what they held. That I begin with. Secondly, he says he went to Jerusalem. This is Galatians. He went to Jerusalem and he saw only James, Peter, the one he kind of condescendingly calls the seeming somebodies. he doesn't even give them, the leaders. He kind of, the so-called leaders. Of course he would have learned stuff. How could he not? Even if he didn't want to, they would have told him. So Paul knew the tradition. And I would even throw the emphasis far more on what he had learned as a persecutor, even than what he might have learned from, say, Peter or James. But I have no problem with that.
What was Paul's view on the relationship between a Christian and a government, like what we see in Romans, where he talks about, like in places like in Romans 13? Is he trying to reconcile, try to tell people to get along with the government so that there's no conflict? What's going on there?
Okay, it's a huge controversy, as you well know, and I've gone backwards and forwards myself on it. Look, if somebody had said to Paul, let me put it hypothetically, in Romans, remember, probably the time he's writing, Nero is in, and maybe there was a lot of discussion about taxation and with a new emperor. But in any case, if somebody said to Paul, should we pay our taxes or not? I'm absolutely certain Paul would say yes. He might add, don't get yourself crucified over taxes. I think that would be his answer. Now, that's not my problem with 13. What we call 13 of Romans, chapter 13. It's this statement that he makes that the archontes, the rulers, are certified by God and have the right, and you must obey them. That the term rulers, archontes, that's the only, comes up twice else, I think, before in Paul, and comes up in that one I quoted already, where he says they would not have crucified if the archontes of the world, the rulers of the world, had known what was going on, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. He mentions it twice. That's not a neutral term for leaders. There's lots of words for leaders. I do this very delicately, Jay, because people say, well, you just don't like that statement about do whatever the rulers tell you. It's not I don't like it. I think it's kind of stupid. Nobody gives a blank check, or they shouldn't give a blank check to rulers. Not even today. You should at least have your conscience and wonder about it. So, but the more important thing is, I can't imagine Paul writing Archontes. Surely you could use some other term. That's his bad term for rulers. I think I think what happened, and if somebody says, "Well, you just don't like it," and you're saying this, fine, fine, okay. Let me put it this way: if it comes from Paul, it's the dumbest thing he ever wrote. Okay,
Hmm.
I'm suspicious that maybe it came from First Peter, because what you find exactly in First Peter, the letter attributed to Peter, is exactly that statement that you should obey the emperor. I think it may well be part of the Peterization of Paul, to use an awful term, of making Paul not only under Peter, but kind of agree with Peter, everything Peter says. I think that whole process is going on, maybe even in Romans itself, that some scribe reading this, knowing it, says, well, let me put it wider. It's not just you pay your taxes, you obey your rulers. I tentatively, I would say, I don't think he wrote that. But if you
Hmm.
think he did, it's still dumb.
I'm going to throw something in there real quick. What's interesting is, and I know there's a lot of different opinions about this in scholarship, but in Marcion's version of Romans, it doesn't have that stuff in there about Romans 13.
I'd forgotten that, Jacob.
Yeah, just want to throw that in there. I just think
Well,
it's
good. Thank
interesting.
you. Thank
Yeah,
you. That's one thing I should have known. I'd forgotten that completely if I ever knew it. So I'm going to check it out. Thank you. Yeah,
yeah. Oh, no problem.
that
It's
one
interesting.
section. You meant all of Romans.
At least, yeah. I think I'm not positive the entire chapter of Romans 13 is missing,
Yeah,
but Romans 13 1 to 7 is definitely not there. Yeah,
yeah. Because the other argument for it too is that if you take out that section, it reads more or less smoothly from the section before it, which is the end of chapter 12 for us. But of course, all of this
yeah.
is later. Into the next section. It's kind of talking about being nonviolent and all the rest of it.
Mm-hmm. We have a super
Now,
chat question. You were saying something. I'm sorry.
no, I was going to ask you, are you certain about 13? It's not 16. I'm getting mixed up now
Yeah,
myself.
it's in Romans 13 where he says, all governments are appointed by God.
And
Uh,
that's missing in Marcion.
that's missing in Marcion. In fact,
Okay.
when you mentioned Romans 16, all of Romans 16 is missing from Marcion. The whole thing.
Okay.
We have a super chat question from iFish Natai. Paul
Okay.
describes Jesus having a heavenly body and not a resurrected corpse. Should Christians embrace the Talpiot tomb instead of despising the thought?
Um, honestly, I think the Talpiot tomb, and I've been there, is a great story. And it's a useful, what do you call it, teaching moment. Everyone in the Roman Empire took it for granted that when somebody died, they had some type of recognizable human form consistent with who they were. Otherwise, when, say, Aeneas went down to Hades, how could he pick out his father Anchises? Now, if somebody asked Paul, well, what kind of a body did they have? Well, you could talk about, spectral body, but they took it for granted. Of course, they have a body. Otherwise, you couldn't have apparitions. You couldn't have visions. I wouldn't know who the vision was. So that was taken for granted. But I don't take that in any sense literally. It was just part of the presumption of vision and apparition. I I don't think it has anything to do with it. I think if you ask Paul, okay, Paul, now we have found the Talpiot tomb. We have really found the bones of Jesus. There's a big sign there in Aramaic that said, these are the bones of Jesus. Supposing we found it and it was absolutely convincing to everyone this is valid, would Paul say, could be no resurrection? Paul would probably say, get a life. Get a life. The body molders into dust. The spirit gets its own new body. Of course, I don't think that would bother Paul at all. Because he, as he says, flesh and blood cannot enter the kingdom of God. Now, it would bother Luke, by the way, because Luke thinks that resurrection is kind of coming back to life and you can have a meal. Paul would be tearing his hair out. Could Jesus just have a meal after? Paul would have said, come on. So no, I think any of that is interesting stuff, but bad theology.
And in my final question, when did Paul think Jesus was coming back, and where did he get the idea that Jesus was going to come back?
I think the earlier idea that very soon God is going to consummate the world because empires are getting stronger and stronger. Now we have the Roman Empire. Surely, 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 God's going to finally clean up the mess of the world. We call that eschatology or apocalyptic eschatology. It's simply the faith that if God is just and the world is unjust, soon God's going to clean up the mess of the world. And it was an idea at the time of Jesus. Okay, along we come the idea that the Messiah has already come. So we're not waiting for him soon, but he's here already. But the idea of soon lingers on. So the consummation of the Messianic age, it has begun, but it will be consummated soon. Paul thought it would be within his lifetime, or at least within the lifetime of his generation. I think it was part of the dominance, the still dominance of that apocalyptic expectation, which is simply apocalypse is what happens to a prophet when the prophet loses faith, or at least nerve. That God is operational in the world is the prophetic belief. But where is it, says the apocalypticist? God's coming soon is the answer. I think it was part of the, you might call the mood of the age. And even though Paul is insisting the Messiah has come, the Messiah has come, the Messiah has come, okay, but it'll be over soon. And he was off by 2,000 years and counting. And when he said soon, he meant soon. He didn't really say soon. He just thought that he would be alive when it happened. He was wrong. Anyone else who said in the first century the consummation will be soon was wrong too.
We have another super chat from my fish and a tie. Thank you for your super chat. He says, "Thank you, Dr. Crossan. God bless you."
Thank you very much. Thank you. That was lovely.
And I wanted to tell everybody just real quick to go get Paul the Pharisee. The History Valley Amazon affiliate link is in the description below, and it's also pinned in the pinned comment in the live chat, and will be also in the pinned comment below the video. Thank you, Dom.
And thank you again very, very much, Jacob. Always a pleasure to be with you and with your super chatters.
Thank you again for joining me.